are delighted to have Jeff here. He is the director of the Mothman Museum in Point Pleasant, Ohio. He started the Mothman Museum. He has written 2 books about the Mothman, and he is probably one of the premier experts in this area. And to make things short, this is Jeff.
Thanks a lot. I wouldn't say I'm an expert. I've researched a lot, but you know, I'll take that if you want. So.
Okay.
But anyways, thanks for having me, and I will go ahead and I've got a little PowerPoint that I'll go over, explain some things, and if you guys have questions or whatever, you know, I'll try to answer them for you. A little brief history about myself. I was born and raised in Point Pleasant. I was about 5 years old in 1966 when all this took place. And I don't remember a lot about it, but my parents, some of my relatives and neighbors and people like that, that's how I learned a lot of the things that went on and some of the events that took place and stuff. So what my presentation is pretty much a summary of what all happened. I'll talk a little bit about, you know, what people were seeing or what they were saying they were seeing, some of the theories as to what it was, a little bit of history of Point Pleasant. How many in here has been to Point Pleasant before? Okay. Point Pleasant's about an hour from here. Well, not even an hour. Okay. And it's basically, you know, like Mayberry. You know, it's still a small town. You know, not a lot of industry. You know, the hospitals and the schools and some of the plants and places like that are your main employers. But it does have a rich history as far as going back to the Revolutionary War and even some of the stuff like the Mothman activity and stuff. So again, you know, the Mothman, you know, we'll talk about it. I'll tell you how the name came about. Some people have different theories as to what it was. Some people thought it was just an enormous bird that people were seeing, and other people thought it was something a little different than that. But pretty much, Point Pleasant, West Virginia, most everybody here I think knows where it's at. You know, we sit right on the Ohio River. Route 35 goes right past Point Pleasant. And again, you know, everybody knows their neighbors. It's a lot like Athens, just not quite as big as Athens and stuff. Okay, and even small towns like this here. You know, we've got New Haven, West Virginia, Mason, West Virginia, Leon, and some of the smaller towns and places like that. But I always try to give everybody an idea of where Point Pleasant is located. And we go back to the Revolutionary War, where we had Chief Cornstalk, General Lewis. There's actually statues of both of these guys at the riverfront park, and they have murals and things like that. A lot of people, when they talk about Mothman, they talk about that Mothman statue. I don't know if I have any pictures of it on here, but there was a local guy named Bob Roach who was a metal worker all his life, retired, and he built that statue. The city commissioned him to do that statue, and it's world famous now. That statue, you can drive by there at 3 o'clock in the morning, there'll be people out there getting their pictures taken of the statue. It's stainless steel. But anyways, this is Twin Park. This sits right where the Ohio River meets the Kanawha River. And Twin means where the waters mingle, where the rivers meet. That's an Indian term. So, you know, Point Pleasant has a lot of history and stuff. Some people ask about Chief Cornstalk's curse. Okay, Cornstalk was a Shawnee chief who was murdered by some settlers over a land dispute. Him and his son both were murdered. And the story goes back so many years as to when he was killed. Some people say that he put a curse on the town of Point Pleasant for 200 years. Other people think that that was just hearsay, that was just made up over the years, even with the Mothman story. Some people thought a lot of that was made up. You guys can decide, you know, for yourself on that. I'm not here to convince anybody or anything, but I can show you some of the theories and evidence and things like that. But anyways, the worst disaster that ever happened in Point Pleasant, does anybody know what that would be? Silver Bridge disaster, which was 50 years ago. Okay, that was in December 15, 1967, and that was the single worst bridge disaster in U.S. history. It still is, and it probably always will be. But after that bridge fell, Lyndon B. Johnson enacted the new bridge inspection requirements and things like that. So 46 people died on the bridge disaster, but it changed the way that other bridges are inspected and stuff. So if anything good came out of that disaster, it would be that. But you know, it's still fresh in the minds of people who live in Point Pleasant. And I do remember when the bridge fell. I was 6 years old when that happened. But, this is the Silver Bridge. That went from Point Pleasant over to Canalga. And that bridge fell. It was 40 years old. It was in pretty bad shape. At that time, nobody knew that it was in that bad of shape. So, and I'm sure most of you all remember when the bridge fell and stuff. So, and the reason the bridge is brought into the Mothman story is this all happened within that same time period and stuff. Okay. When World War II started, there's an area about 9 miles north of Point Pleasant, and it's called the TNT area. Okay, and that is where the government started buying land and manufacturing explosives. That's how the name of the TNT area came about. The reason I talk about the TNT area is because that's where a lot of these big bird or Mothman sightings were taking place in 1966. You had these big 3-story power plant buildings that were all vacant. After the war ended, pretty much what happened was the government just left all the buildings there. They just left town, left all the buildings. That's where all the teenagers would go hang out, drag race, lovers lane, and all that kind of stuff. This building here is what they call the North Power Plant. That was a generator plant during World War II, but in the 60s it was an empty building. It had the catwalks in it and all that kind of stuff. This is actually where a lot of people saw that creature, bird, Mothman, whatever, in and around this building. Some people saw it on top of the building. Okay? So what happened was everybody and their brother got in their cars and was up in the TNT area looking for it, shooting at stuff. The National Guard had to come in and kind of quarantine that area off because there was too many people up there looking for it. So that brought up in the minds of a lot of the locals, well, they're trying to hide something. So that government conspiracy and all that stuff kind of came into play. Also, even today, there's over 100 of these igloos or bunkers. You can still drive up there and walk inside of about 5 or 6 of these bunkers, these igloos. The reason they call them igloos is because they're all stone structures and they're covered by grass and weeds and things like that. Okay? The reason behind that was during World War II, if Germany or Japan would have made it this far, and they would have flown over top of the TNT area, which was basically a powder keg because of all the ammunition and things like that, they would never see any of this stuff because it was all hidden from the air. They would fly right over and all they would see was farmland. That's what the government wanted them to do. I think it was just basically farmland and stuff. So you can still walk in these. These stay about 60 degrees year-round. If it's 95 degrees outside and you walk in one of these, it's just like it's got central air. And they're probably about as big as this room, a little bit bigger than this room. And the domes are completely round, and the concrete is 4 foot thick all the way around. So if anything would have hit it, a bomb or whatever, it would have been hard to explode that and stuff. These are still standing up in the TNT area. This was where the railway train would come underneath. They would load chemicals into it. The locals call this Stonehenge, but you can still go up there and look around, take pictures and things like that. If you come in the Mothman Museum, we've got a free map that we can give you. It shows you how to find some of these landmarks and stuff like that. But they're really eerie, you know, especially at this time of the year. You go up there at 2 o'clock in the morning and walk around some of this stuff. There's been all kinds of film crews that come in to do the Mothman documentaries. We just did one this past summer for Travel Channel. It's called Mothman, Myth, or Monster. And that's an hour-long show that we did. It took them about a week and a half to film it. These right here were rounded at the top because they put the big steel drums in there, the chemical drums, and they pull those train cars in. So the TNT area was a city within itself. You couldn't just drive up there and look around. You had security guards, all that good stuff. Okay? So this brings us to the eyewitness accounts, you know, for these Mothman sightings and stuff. And the first sighting was actually, you would ask me about, some of the other areas that people had seen this. The first official sighting in Point Pleasant was November 15, 1966. But on November 14th, there was a farmer named Noel Partridge. And I got to interview him in my second book before he passed away. And he had a German Shepherd named Bandit, big old German Shepherd dog. Pretty much what happened with him was about 11 o'clock at night. Him and his family, he had like 6 or 7 kids and his wife. They're all sitting around watching TV in the living room. And he told me the TV started making a winding sound, like it was just winding up. He said the screen exploded. All the glass went out on the floor, all the kids freaked out. And he said he looked out the window, and in the back field behind his house, he saw red rotating lights. Now, keep in mind, this was 1966, a lot of UFO activity going on in the tri-state area, okay? He told me he saw red rotating lights. When he opened the door, his dog bolted out the door and went outside. They never saw the dog again. They could never find the dog. They looked for it the next day, and they looked for it for a week. Couldn't find it. And he could never figure out what it was. But he said he went out the next day, and all the grass was matted down. It was flat in that area where he saw these lights and stuff. And what's kind of ironic is the next night in Point Pleasant is when the 2 young couples saw this thing, and it came over top of the car, this bird-like creature. And they told the police that they saw a dead dog laying by the road as they were coming back into town. Now that was 2 hours away, and Noel Partridge thought that whatever he saw could have maybe picked up that dog and took off with it. That's a theory. It sounds far-fetched, but this was part of the, where he talks about his dog picked up, saw 2 red reflections in the meadow. Dog rushed out into the woods, and he never saw the dog again. So Bandit is kind of like a famous animal in the Mothman story. But those are some of the articles that came out, and that's in Doddridge County. And like I said, it's about 2 hours away from Point Pleasant. But the next night in Point Pleasant, this is the most famous sighting right here. And the way I kind of got pulled into the story was, there was 2 young couples, 19, 20 years old. Both of them had just recently been married. One couple was Linda and Roger Scarberry. Okay, Roger lived directly across the street from my house, and Linda lived 4 doors down. Again, I was 5 years old. I had no clue who they were. I mean, I was just a little kid running around on the street. But as I got older and I started reading people's books like John Keel's Mothman Prophecies book, and I started seeing their names, and I'm thinking, those people lived right beside of us. And pretty much what happened with them is they were up there, and I interviewed Linda extensively. This is another picture of that North Power Plant. This is what it looked like back in the 60s, with all the kids would get on the top and paint their names on it. There's a better picture. You can see how big those buildings were. It was actually a North Power Plant, and there was a South Power Plant. Now, about 92 or 93 is when they tore all these down. You had catwalks inside, all of these stone walks, and a couple people I had interviewed that were in the building when they saw this thing. As a matter of fact, there was a guy named Bob Bosworth. Him and his buddy were actually in that building looking for it, and they saw it. And they quickly exited the building and took off. And what's really weird, the guy that was with him was named Alan Coates. And he still lives in Point Pleasant. I had to call him on the phone to get permission to use his name in my book. When I talked to him on the phone, I said, I'm calling about that experience you guys had in that North Power Plant. And he told me, he said, you know what? He said, I had just got back from a tour of Vietnam. And he said, I'd never seen anything in Vietnam that scared me as bad as what I saw in that building. That was his exact words. I'd like to talk to him a little more and stuff. Okay, so this right here, Linda and Roger Scarberry and Steve and Mary Mallett. Those were the 2 couples that saw this thing. Steve and Mary Mallett are still married to this day. They still live in Point Pleasant, and they will refuse any interview, anybody asking questions about what they saw. They will admit that they did see it. I work with Steve Mallett's brother, who teaches a shop class where I work, and he won't even talk to him about it. He won't, none of it. Now, Roger Starberry is still alive. He lives in Tennessee. Same deal. He's made it clear that he'll never talk about it. He admits that he saw it. This is probably the rarest headline that we've got at the museum. This is November 16, 1966, 5 cents for the newspaper. And couple sees man-sized bird, creature, something. But that's the first official breaking headline that came out in Point Pleasant. You didn't have the internet, Facebook, or any of that kind of stuff. Everybody read the newspaper and stuff, okay? So, this is probably the second rarest, and the reason I was asking you about the Athens Messenger is because there was a newspaper reporter in Point Pleasant named Mary Hire who worked for the Athens Messenger. The Athens Messenger at that time was delivered in Point Pleasant, so there was an office there, and she was the head of the office. The other newspaper was the Point Pleasant Register. And she's the person who broke the story, to the public with her article. She had an article called, a weekly article called Where the Waters Mingle. And it was like a Dear Abby type thing. She would write about families and things going on. Again, you didn't have the internet, so everybody would read her articles. And this is a picture of Linda and Roger and Steve and Mary Mallett. That was taken. What happened was after they went to the police department, the sheriff's department, they took them back up there, and they were out there kind of looking around to see if they could see any tracks or anything like that. But again, this was 51 years ago and stuff. So, but they were definitely spooked by whatever it was that happened. This is a rare picture of Roger. They were actually in a '57 Chevy. And I remember as a kid him working on that car all the time across the street and banging around on the car and stuff. But that was what he looked like back then and stuff. Their experience was they were up there riding around in the TNT area. Linda told me they were up there drag racing. They had that '57 Chevy. They was meeting up with their friends and stuff. And she said as they were getting ready to leave, they were driving by that North Power Plant when they saw what they thought was a man standing in the road. As the headlights came across. And Linda said as they got closer, they saw wings come out from behind this man. And she said it had 2 red eyes about the size of baseballs, about 2 inches apart. And they thought, well, it's somebody dressed up in a costume trying to scare us. But she said as they got closer to it, it looked at them, and she said it took off and ran towards that North Power Plant. And I asked her if it ran or if it flew. She said it was very awkward. It just kind of hobbled through the grass. So they're looking at each other thinking, what's going on? This is the drawing that Roger drew for the sheriff's department. They asked him to take a piece of paper and draw what he saw or what they saw. And they said it was about 6 to 7 feet tall. Couldn't really make out a head, but you could see the 2 red eyes on it. And the wings came down, but she said the wingspan was about 10 to 12 feet when the wings went out. So that would definitely catch your attention and stuff. The thing is after they saw it, they kept driving in their car. They drove out to Route 62, took a left on Route 62, went down the road about a mile. But she said when they turned left, they saw it again standing by a billboard. There was a big billboard there. And she said it was almost like it was watching them. And she said, there it is again. Said the wings came out, flapped one time, and she said it just went straight up. It just went straight up in the air. So they were still a little spooked. They didn't know what was going on. That's when they hit the straight stretch going down Route 62. And this is when it starts getting a little scarier, because she thought it was done. They were just going to go home and that'd be it. But then she saw it come over top of the car. And the first thing she told me, she said, I thought it looked like a leg dangling by the window. She was in the passenger side. She said it had muscles in the leg, and then when she looked out, she said it was flying over top of that car. And she said every so often it would just flap its wings once or twice and stay right with that car. And then it would go away for a little bit and then come back. And the most chilling thing she ever told me, I said, how big was the wingspan? Did you know how big the wingspan was? And she said when it flapped its wings, she said it would hit the bottom of the car door with those wings. You could hear it slapping off the car door. And when they got back to the police department, she said Roger was all mad because it scratched up the paint on the doors of his car. It's 57 Chevy and stuff. Now, there's been people try to find out what happened to that car because they divorced after this happened. They went their separate ways and stuff, and she told me she sold that car. But there was always people trying to think, you know, if they could find that car, maybe there was some evidence or whatever. But who knows where it's at now. But this is the drawing that he did for the Sheriff's Department. Okay? They were very hesitant to go to the Sheriff's Department. They actually stopped at a little place called Tiny's Drive-In where she worked as a waitress. Okay? They ran in there. The guy that owned it, who I talked to on the phone a few years back, he let them in. And he told me, he said they were terrified. He said they were white as ghosts. He called the Sheriff's Department. They weren't going to go to the Sheriff's Department because they knew if they did, everybody would think they were crazy and nuts. And they did suffer a lot of humiliation from people in the town and stuff. And that's why a lot of them won't talk about it, because they were made fun of, called crazy and all that kind of stuff. This is another rare archive that we have at the museum, if you come into the museum. These are the handwritten depositions that the Sheriff's Department asked them to write describing exactly what they saw. Okay, when they went to the police department, the sheriff's deputy said, you go in this room, you go in this room, you go in this room, you go in this room. Because they didn't want them sitting together and saying, well, let's write this. They wanted to see if they were actually telling the same story. And I have 3 of the 4 depositions, and they're all identical. They all describe the same thing. We have those on display. So Linda Scarberry and Roger and Stephen Mary Mallett, those are the heavyweight, the first official sightings and stuff. But soon after that, within a week, there was a lady named Marcella Bennett. She has passed away. She thought the whole thing was just a big joke, and she was out to prove to everybody that it was just somebody in a costume. And her family, some of her family lived in the TNT area in a house up there. So they all got together. They were going to go up there and start pecking on the windows and scare the kids because they just thought it was just a big, you know, time to have a little bit of fun and scare some people. But as she went back towards her car to get in the car, it stood up beside of the car. And she said she just thought it was somebody dressed in khaki clothes. Said it was like a dirty brown grayish look to it. She was carrying her daughter. This is like a rendition of what happened. The daughter I actually went to high school with, but she was carrying the daughter. And when she said she looked down, and she just kept going and looking up, and she said it was standing by her car. She took off running back to the house and tripped and fell and landed on the kid. And finally got into the house, but all the other kids there were all running around and went into the house. I talked to one of them, and he said they pulled the curtain shut, and he saw a shadow walk by the window and peered into the window. Then they heard the flapping noise, and whatever it was, it took off. By the time the police got up there, which this is 9 miles outside of town, so by the time the police got up there, it was too late. This is one of those articles that Mary Hire wrote. She was the one that worked for the Athens Messenger. On November 25th, this is just not even 2 weeks later, Tom Urey was driving in his car on Route 62 going towards Clarksburg. He said it was about 7:30 in the morning. He saw what he thought was a helicopter come up over top of the trees. And he said, when I looked, it was an enormous bird. Now his story has always been that it was a bird. He said it was the most enormous bird he's ever seen in his life. And he said it started circling his car as he was driving, and it got closer and closer. And he thought it was going to come down and maybe cause him to have a wreck. He called the sheriff's department, and he told him, he said, I think I found your Mothman. But, you know, his story was just within 10 days after the other people saw this thing. But he said it was enormous. He said the wingspan was just gigantic for a bird that would be flying around here in this area. This is a recollection of his vision. That was about 7. This right here was another article that we have. This was from the Stars and Stripes newspaper in Vietnam. This was November 20th, just 5 days after. News spread fast, even overseas. You know, there were articles about, you know, the United Press, Associated Press. People were finding out about it, and you didn't even have the internet at that time. Athens Messenger. This was in December. Creature seen again flying over the TNT area. So there were a lot of people seeing it. There was a lot of people looking for it. This was Mary Howard right here. She was the Athens Messenger reporter. She died when she was only 54 years old of a heart attack. She was the one reporting all this stuff. And I'll talk about these men in black that came into the picture too. They were the guys that were showing up to these witnesses' houses, and it terrified a lot of people because they didn't know who they were. They were not real happy about people reporting this kind of stuff. So you've seen the movie The Men in Black with Will Smith, and you know that's kind of a modern version. But back in the 60s, if somebody dressed in black and had black glasses and a hat pulled up to your house and came up and knocked on your door, you know, it was usually not for, you know, Sunday brunch. It was either a government agent or a military person or whatever these men in black were, you know. So there was a lot of these witnesses that told me, said, look, you know, Mary Howard even told people that she would look out her window at night and see a car sitting in front of her house with some of these guys sitting there kind of like watching her house. They would come into her office and ask her questions about why she was reporting this stuff that she needed to stop. And I think, you know, she got a little antsy there for a while because she didn't know who they were or what their motives were or anything. But her niece still lives in Point Pleasant and worked with my wife for a while. And I've talked to her several times, and I asked her, I said, do you believe that the Men in Black stuff was real? And she said, I know it was, because she was like 12 or 13, and she remembered her Aunt Mary talking about, you know, these people and who they were. So at this time, there was a lot of UFO activity going on too. As a matter of fact, the UFO activity was going on before the Mothman sightings. So you pick up any magazine from 66 through 69, people were seeing all kinds of crazy stuff flying around in the skies. Right there on 30th Street where I live, there was a lady who reported a silver disc flew right over top of her house in broad daylight. She saw it, she could hear the buzzing sound, and it just went right over her house. This is all documented stuff from Point Pleasant, and I'm sure it might have been happening in this area too. There's somebody's sketch of what it looked like, you know, some of the different things that were flying around. There was different theories too that the government and the military were doing experiments with stealth technology and things like that at the time, and it was during the Vietnam War. So John Keel, who I'll talk about here in a second, was a writer who came from New York City. He's the one who compiled all of the sighting reports and wrote the book called The Mothman Prophecies. Okay, has anybody seen the movie with Richard Gere, The Mothman Prophecies? Okay, so that movie was loosely based on John Keel's novel and book. I had a chance to meet John Keel on several occasions before he passed away, and I was able to discuss a few things with him and ask him about this, but he thought a lot of this was government conspiracy. He was one of those conspiracy type authors, right? Dolly Grady was our neighbor on 30th Street, and she's the one that said she watched that flying saucer go right over top of her house. Said she was coming home from church, pulled out and went over top of the car, pulled in the driveway, got out, and she said it just went right over. And this is where I talk about John Keel. This is what he looked like back in the mid-60s. And he was from New York City. He was a writer, an author, very eccentric, very odd person. You know, when I met him, you know, he was sort of like grandfather type person, but he had a real dry sense of humor. But he was interested in all this stuff because, you know, he'd heard about it. So he would come back and forth to Point Pleasant to gather all this information and stuff. He actually stayed on 30th Street with Linda Scarberry's family, and they even announced it in the paper that he was coming to town to investigate some of this stuff. I have a lot of the typed letters, the original letters, that he was sending back and forth to those witnesses. These are original transcripts and letters where he was going back and forth with Linda Scarberry, Mary Howard, and talking about all this stuff that was going on and warning them, you know, hey, if somebody dressed in a black suit shows up at your house, don't answer the door. So we have a lot of that stuff in the museum. I've got boxes of that stuff at home that I haven't even displayed yet. Here's some of the stuff that he's talking about. Harassed UFO witnesses, talking about some of these men in black. He said a lot of them would dress up in fake military uniforms. You could spot the fake ones and stuff because they weren't authentic, and they would pose as like an Air Force officer asking questions about what did you see, what flew over your house, and all that. but he said that they weren't authentic. They weren't from the government. They were just trying to find out what was going on and stuff. Here's some of the eyewitness descriptions. This is from one of my books. Somebody, as a wildlife illustrator, sent me this. I always thought it was kind of a neat looking rendition with the wings and stuff. Nobody was ever physically harmed or attacked or anything, but a few of those witnesses came right up on it, you know, and saw it pretty close. They didn't stick around very long, and a lot of those witnesses were not really thrilled about seeing it. A lot of them didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to relive all that stuff. This is probably one of the most accurate type descriptions here. Kind of an awkward type walk, big wingspan, and all those witnesses all talked about those red eyes. And they said they were all almost hypnotic. Because I'd say, well, what did its face look like? Did it have a nose? They're like, we couldn't tell because we were riveted to the eyes. We were looking at the eyes, and that's all we could really, you know, make out and stuff. This is, of course, you know, the comic book rendition of what happened, you know, when it came over top of the cars. Now, the name Mothman, and I'll tell you how that came about. Mary Hire and a lot of the news reporters would get together and have press conferences with the sheriff's department. As a matter of fact, I think the sheriff's department's coming up here in a minute. There's those red eyes. So right here, this is a picture of one of the press conferences the sheriff's department had soon after all the sightings started. This guy was named Albie Sullivan. They told him he was going to be running patrols by himself up in the TNT area, and he took his badge and put it on the table and quit. He said that's not going to happen. So he quit, and if I would have ever known, I would have liked to have talked to him. But they called it a press conference and stuff. All the newspaper reporters and TV reporters and all that. But the name Mothman actually came from a real popular TV show at the time called Batman. There was a character in those Batman series called Mothman. You didn't really see a lot of him, but people were describing bat-like, moth-like wings. So one of those reporters just said Mothman, and that's how it stuck. But if you talk to somebody in Point Pleasant today, they'll say the big bird. You know, they'll say the bird or the big bird. That's what they refer to it as a lot. Most people will say Mothman, but the locals always just thought they just called it the bird. There was a local professor from West Virginia University who came and said this is what they were seeing, a sandhill crane, and that insulted all those witnesses because they said, well, we know what a crane looks like, and that's not what we saw. Maybe somebody else saw the crane, but what we saw looked like a man and stood 6 to 7 foot tall. And John Keel himself said, you know, some people said it was an owl, a barn owl. And John Keel said, I've seen a lot of owls, but I've never seen one stand 6 foot tall. So people were kind of clutching for straws, trying to come up with an explanation as to what it was. There was a local farmer named Ace Henry, and we actually did a Mysteries at the Museum episode on this right here about the owl. He shot an owl, which was protected by law at the time, in his barn because he said that's what people were seeing, so he just went out and blasted the owl. And we have the owl at the museum. It's stuffed. You know, they stuffed it. And they did an episode on Mysteries at the Museum about that owl. More of the UFO stuff, Route 62, tons of UFO stuff going on. And that brings us to, like I said, you know, you had the Mothman sightings, the UFO activity, the men in black were showing up, you know, kind of harassing some of the witnesses. And that brings us to, you know, what some people thought was the culmination of all this activity. If you watch Richard Gere's movie, the end of the movie ends with the bridge disaster and all that kind of stuff. The movie was loosely based on John Keel's book because in the movie it takes forever for the bridge to fall. Richard Gere's jumping in the water, you know, saving people. In reality, when the Silver Bridge fell, it took about 2 minutes and that was it. Some people thought that after the bridge fell, all the Mothman sightings and Men in Black and stuff stopped, which is really not true because I've talked to people even into the 70s, even some into the 80s, and we're seeing some weird stuff. But that right there is one of the rare newspaper articles, and this was from the Point Pleasant side here going over. Basically what happened was that bridge was designed with what they call eye bars. If you think of a bicycle chain and the little cogs that go in, and when that eye bar sheared, then the whole bridge just started falling apart. Started on the Ohio side and went towards the Point Pleasant side. Just like a stack of dominoes, and it just went just like that. And these are some of the pictures And that's a picture from the Point Pleasant side. That ramp broke just right there, just even. It just went on the bridge. This is out of Popular Mechanics. Talks about the bridge disaster, what happened. There was actually a picture of the eye bar, which we have in the museum. We have a piece of the bridge in the museum. It's about like this right here that somebody donated. And if you come to Point Pleasant, come to the Mothman Museum, just 2 blocks down is the River Museum. And you can go in there and they have a whole upstairs is dedicated to the Silver Bridge and the disaster and stuff like that. They have a scale model of the bridge, shows exactly where every car was when the bridge fell and everything. What happened, the Army Corps of Engineers came in and took all the pieces of the bridge out of the water, and over in Henderson, West Virginia, laid all those pieces out, just like dinosaur bones, and reconstructed the bridge. And one of those guys happened to be walking around one day and just looked down and seen that eye bar, and he was like, he seen that crack in that eye bar. And they traced that back to an 1/8 of an inch piece of rust that was in that when they forged that metal back in the 20s that caused it to rot from the inside and shear. Every day for 40 years people drive across that bridge, not knowing. People were like, this bridge is going to fall, no, they designed them to shake. There was only one other bridge like the Silver Bridge. It was in St. Mary's, West Virginia. So as soon as the Silver Bridge fell, they closed down. And then they tore it down and rebuilt that bridge. Okay, so movie versus reality. We talked a little bit about that. The movie was based in modern day times, not the 60s, like the real events. In the movie, the amount of people that died on the bridge was 39. In reality, it was 46. So in the museum, we have a whole section there about the movie. We have a lot of movie props too that was used in there. This is where what it looks like today, where that North Power Plant stood. It's just an empty lot now. They come in and tore all that stuff down. It was a big liability for the state because all these kids were in there ratting around, playing, and doing all kinds of stuff, so they tore it down. And this is where the Silver Bridge ramp was. Next in December will be the 50th anniversary, and they'll have a ceremony downtown where the bridge was. But there's 3 trees there, and that's a memorial. They actually have, in the bricks, they have the name of every person who died on the bridge in the bricks right there in front of the 3 trees. So if you ever come to Point Pleasant, one of the landmarks there and stuff that people need to see. This is downtown Point Pleasant. This is actually where the museum is now. This is an older picture. The statue sits right up here in Gun Park, the Mothman statue. It's about 10 to 12 feet tall. This is the lady that used to have Harris Steakhouse. That was a little diner there on Main Street. Her name is Carolyn Harris. She had been here for 40 years. She's the person that I started the Mothman Festival with. And the festival this past September drew over 12,000, I think, 12,000 people. We started that back in 2002. We've done it for 16 years. But she was the staple of downtown. And when she passed away suddenly, it just really caught a lot of people off guard. This soda fountain had been in that diner for 40-some years. And after she passed away, they donated that to the Mothman Museum, so we recreated a small area of the diner where we show the movies. But she's still missed by a lot of people and stuff, and she had just a little home cooking diner right there on Main Street, knew everybody. And she had direct ties to the Mothman story and the Silver Bridge story. Her 4-year-old son and her husband both were on the bridge when it fell, and neither one of them made it. So a lot of these film crews would come to town and they'd be asking us questions, and she would tell them up front, I don't want to talk about the bridge, and they would ask me, well, and I told them, I would tell them. Harris Steakhouse was the name of her diner and stuff. These are the 2 books. I did this one in 2002 and this one in 2005, and I'm working on a 3rd book. It's just taking a little longer than I thought. These books are documentary style books. There's no fiction in them. I did a lot of interviews with people. I didn't change anything. Whatever they told me was word for word put in there. A lot of rare archives, newspaper clippings, things like that. This is some of the pictures from the festival. That's my daughter there in the red. These are some of the men in black that show up to the festival and stuff. And again, we drew probably about 12,000 people. It's got to the point now where the state of West Virginia brings in traffic control and security and all that stuff. They handle all that for us. That's the costume I had a guy design for me. He designs all the college mascot costumes. He does Marshall University's Buffalo guy that runs around. It took him over a year to build. There he is right there, Dale Morton. And of course I have to hire a real skinny kid to wear it because it fits like real tight. The first kid we tried it on, he couldn't get the bottom part up past here, so we had to find the skinniest kid that we could get. So that's pretty cool though. A couple of men in black there on Main Street. There we go. We have that on display in the museum this year, and then the Ghostbusters came and they brought their Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. You know, they blew him up. He's gigantic. Anybody ever watch a TV show called Mountain Monsters with the Ames team? Okay, those guys all came this year. They came last year. So we get a few people that, you know, some TV people that come in. A lot of guest speakers and authors. A lot of vendors, you know, people bring in all kinds of artwork and paintings and books and things like that. A lot of UFO stuff, ghost hunting stuff, it kind of, you know, gets thrown in there too. Mothman Pancakes, they weren't there this year, but they're out of Athens. That guy up there is a chef. His name is Robert Brannon. Does anybody know him? But he's a chef up in Athens somewhere, and what they do is they come down and they do that for charity. All the money they raise for that, they give to a veterans home up there in Athens. But they're real popular, but he couldn't come this year, so. But that's part of the festival there too. Mothman Museum and Research Center, we're open every day of the week now. Hours usually from noon to about 5. The weekend hours are expanded a little bit. We have websites, mothmanmuseum.com, mothmanfestival.com, Facebook, all that kind of stuff. Here's some pictures within the museum. John Keel's jacket that he wore the day they dedicated the statue. Like I said, he was very eccentric. And he was in Carolyn's Diner eating breakfast while they were out there waiting on him to dedicate the statue with all the news crews, reporters, and they're like, where's Mr. Keel? And I said, I think he's down there at the diner. And they said, well, go down there and get him because they're waiting on him, you know. I thought, uh-oh. So I went in there and he was sitting there at the countertop, you know, sitting there. And I walked in, I'm like, Mr. Keel, can you come down here because they're getting ready to dedicate the statue, you know. And he said, tell them I'm finishing my breakfast and I'll be there. Like that. I'm like, all right. So I went back there and told him, and sure enough, about 10 minutes later, here he comes. But he had that white jacket on and stuff. And there's some pictures of him right there. There's some other pictures inside the museum, and we revamped the whole inside of that. That was nothing but a storage area for the hotel across the street. There was junk this tall in that museum when we went in there, and it took forever. If you ever watch that show Hoarders on TV, that's what it looked like. But now it's turned into a really cool place to have a museum and stuff. And that's what I'll end on right there. That's just a sign right outside of Point Pleasant when you're going out of Point Pleasant and stuff. And if you have questions or comments or whatever, I'm happy to answer them if I can, you know. I get a lot of people ask me what did I think it was, and you know, I'm kind of like clueless on that, you know. I just know those people saw stuff. I don't think all of them could have been making it up. Yeah.
Was the airport down there built in the 60s when this was occurring?
That's a good question. There's that airport real close to the TNT area, and it's like it's a small airport.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking it was there during the 60s, but I can't really say for sure because I remember in the 60s them flying over and dropping balloons for Tiny's Drive-In as an advertising thing. There's also an airport over in Gallipolis too.
Yeah.
Now the one in Gallipolis was there because there was a guy named Everett Wedge from Point Pleasant who worked there at that airport. I don't have his account on here, but in that same 2 weeks when all these people were seeing this, they saw what they thought was a plane coming in, and it was doing this, and he said they all ran outside, and he looked up and he said it was a bird. They thought it was a plane. That's how big the wingspan was. They got in one of their planes and tried to go up and follow it. And he said they lost it, but it came back up the river and cut across over towards the TNT area. And he's on some of the documentaries. He passed away several years ago. But he said that they thought it was a plane Because he said, one of them guys said, what's that guy doing in that plane? Because he said it was doing this. And then when they looked, they said it was a bird flying over the airport. And they got in and tried to chase it and stuff.
Yeah, so I've flown down there.
Yeah.
I used to teach aviation.
Okay.
Here, and I use that airport where I can go down there and do check rides and things.
Yeah.
And the way you explained it.
That's
I've
right there
seen
by
all
the T-Terry, yeah.
Yeah, I've seen all the area there.
Yeah.
With all the bunkers and stuff.
Yeah.
And that just kind of came up in my mind is, you know, the general aviation folks that fly out of there.
Right.
I'd be surprised that nobody saw it.
Yeah, and that's a good question. I don't know. They do plane rides during the festivals now too. But you know, that's a good question. You know, Everett Wedge, I never did get a chance to talk to him, but like I said, he was over in Gulf Bliss there. You know where the airport is over there.
Yeah, we fly around.
Yeah.
Flew around that one too.
Yeah, but that's a good question. I'll ask about that, but I'm pretty sure it was around. I know it was there in the 70s. You know, as far as I don't know how active it was in the 60s though. You know. Yeah. Yep.
When's the most recent credible sighting from over there?
Well, like I was mentioning before, last spring, somebody was going down Route 2 towards Huntington, and they took a picture of something flying over top of their car. Okay, as soon as that hit Facebook and the internet, Channel 3 News, and now I walk into the museum after school, and here they all, the reporters there wanting to talk to me. I didn't have a clue what they were talking about, you know. So what the tricky thing about that is every time somebody reports something, you know, then they ask me to validate it, which I can't. You know what I mean? I get emails constantly from Europe, Russia, you know, all over the world, people seeing this stuff. Now, whether or not it's the same thing, who knows? I mean, and in the movie they pushed that theory that every time they see it, then a bad disaster would happen. Maybe the Silver Bridge, Chernobyl, whatever. But, you know, I'll probably go home tonight and look on my emails and there'll be somebody in California. You know, there's a lot of stuff going on in Chicago right now too. So it's one thing to report it, it's another thing to say that that's definitely what people were seeing here in the 60s, you know. It's real hard to you know, to say, yeah, that's the same thing they were seeing, because, you know, there were people saying that they saw a big bird, there's other people saw that it was a monster type thing. Could have been two different things. And then you had a lot of people up there dressing up trying to scare people, which, you know, I had people come up to me and say, yeah, that was my uncle. You know, they made a costume and they were up there scaring people. And I'm like, that probably was after the fact. I mean, who wouldn't want to go up there and try to get in on the fun, you know, and scare people? I mean, you know, and I had somebody, actually it was one of the ex-mayors from Point Pleasant. They said it was him when he was in high school up there doing all that. And I talked to him one time. And, you know, he came to the festival. He's I don't know what he does now, but he's went on to bigger things and everything, and somebody introduced me to him and stuff. And he just looked at me and he's just like, you know, who would ever thought it would turn into this? And I started to say, well, supposedly you were up there in a costume. Well, tell me about that. But I didn't ask him, so, you know.
How did John Keel's book become into a movie? I mean, was there...
John Keel's book, The Mothman Prophecies, was released in 1975. Okay, the story behind that is that there was a writer in Los Angeles named Richard Hayden, and we talked to him one time, and he told us that he suffered from insomnia, and he would walk around all these bookstores in Los Angeles all through the night looking at books, and he picked up John Keel's book, and he thought this would be a really cool movie. So he got you know, permission, and his name's Richard Hayden, and he took that book and wrote a screenplay of it, and then Sony Pictures is the one that picked it up, and they did a documentary that went along with the movie and stuff. We tried to get Richard Hayden to come to the festival and stuff, but he lives so far out, you know, he's never been able to come. But and then I asked John Keel what he thought about the movie, and, you know, he just kind of grumbled, you know, he didn't say anything. But I'm sure they paid him a pretty penny for it. But you know, he lived in New York all his life, he lived by himself. The film crew actually had to go to his apartment to do his interview for the documentary. But he passed away in 2009, I think it was. Was it 2009? Yeah, around 2009. And he came to a couple of the festivals, and he came to visit Point Pleasant just a couple times too. And I actually reunited him with Linda Scarberry and a couple of those original. He hadn't seen him for 40 years, you know. So it was kind of neat to be right there, being a fly on the wall while they were all meeting and talking and stuff. So, any other questions or anything? Yeah.
So, having interviewed some people, did they seem believable, and did they convince you that what they saw, that they weren't exaggerating things? And after interviewing them and this whole thing, all of your research and all of the information you have, are you a true believer?
I am a believer. I know they saw something, because Linda Scarberry, for example, you know, when I would talk to her, over the years, I would try to trick her into telling me something different, you know, just to see if her story held water, if she was going to change it, and she never did change that story. And I could tell by when I talked to her, and she would tell me, she'd say, look, you know, these film crews would come to town and they want to interview. She goes, I don't like talking about this, you know. It changed her way of thinking and stuff. People made fun of them, called them crazy and all that. And those other witnesses and stuff, I thought, you know, who in their right mind would come forth and tell people this stuff without people thinking that they were nuts, you know what I'm saying? But, you know, what it was that they ran into or saw, I can't tell you what it was, but I don't think that many people could have made up that same description and the same story, you know. You know, again, some of them said what we saw was an enormous bird. But now what Linda told me, she said, was different. She said it looked like a man standing there looking at us with those wings. And then for years after that, she had, you know, the same, you know, reoccurring feelings about it and stuff. She told me she just never felt like, you know, she was always looking over her shoulder. Marcella Bennett told me after that happened, it stood up beside her car, said she would never drive at nighttime. Never. She would only drive in the daytime. So, but there was a slew of witnesses, and a lot of them passed away that I never got a chance to talk to. I still get people come in the museum and walk up to me, older people, and they'll say, you know what, we saw that thing, but we never told anybody because we figured it would ruin my dad's business. People think we were all crazy. You know, I had one lady told me in particular, her dad had an auto mechanics place, and she said he told her never to talk about it again. And she told me, you know, word for word what they saw. Now she told me, she said it looked like a prehistoric bird flew right over top of them, up in the TNT area and stuff. Her grandma, her mother, and her were up there, and she said it came right over top of their car and stuff. Went home to tell her dad, and he said, I don't want to hear any more about it because it'll ruin my business, you know. This was in the 60s, you know, so, you know, you go to the report of 7-foot-tall creature with wings and red eyes, and people are going to be like, okay, you know. And then I get people come up and say, well, you know, those kids were all drunk. They're, you know, my parents knew their parents, and I asked my mom, I said, were they like that? She said, no. She said they were good kids. They were never in trouble. They weren't out trying to do stuff to get in trouble and stuff. So, yeah.
What I've always wondered is, how come there's never been any photographs?
Well, we were talking about that earlier too. Back then the technology didn't exist. You didn't have the digital cameras, the movie cameras.
Oh, yeah.
If something happened like that now, people would just be getting their cameras out and filming.
Oh,
But you know, the sheriff's department did go back up there and look for footprints around that North Power Plant that after it happened that night. And I talked to some of the people that were involved with that, and they said, well, they sent them back up there just to kind of, you know, at least let them know that they were looking into it. And John Keel said that there were a few hoof prints like around the building. Nobody took any plaster casts of them because I think most of them just thought, you know, a week from now this is going to be old news. Nobody's going to be talking about it, and here we are 50 years later, you know, talking about it and stuff. So, but there was no, you know, there was a lot of eyewitness descriptions and drawings of what it looked like. And, you know, some of them got real close to it, you know. Bob Bosworth, that was in the North Power Plant, told me, he said, I could have reached out and touched it, And he said for years I wished I would have, but he said I didn't know what was going to happen if I did. But he said they were more worried about getting out of the building, because they just thought it was, they were riding their motorcycles by and they thought it was somebody on top of the building with lights. Because he said he seen 2 red lights up there. He thought it was somebody up there with a little board with lights on it. And they went in and went up, and he said it walked up to the doorway, but it wouldn't come into the moonlight. He said the moonlight was shining through that window, and it just stood there, but he said the shoulders were that broad. But he said you could hear it walking on the glass, and he said it just stood there like this, and then they're like, okay, we're leaving. So I wish some of those people were still around, So anything else? Any other questions or anything? Yeah.
Well, this is something else I've always wondered. Are the Jersey Devil and the Chupacabra and the Mothman all related? Because they've always talked about them the same way they do the Mothman. And I always just
the Jersey Devil was like in the 1800s, 1700s. That was way back then. But when you watch a lot of the shows and stuff, they'll talk about the Chupacabra, which was down like in Texas. People have pictures they put on Facebook now of what it looks like. It looks like a big rat-type dog eating, livestock and things like that. When all this was going on too, there was actually some livestock they found dead over there near Lakin Hospital. John Keel investigated that. Now, some people thought that was UFO related, and stuff, but the Jersey Devil, that's a different ball game, for me and stuff. But they're all interesting stories. Just a different time frame and stuff. I wish my classes at school were this quiet. I teach 9 through 12, and if I have their attention for 5 minutes, it's So usually I'll get them in there and they'll be real quiet, and I'll be talking, and the bell will ring or the fire alarm will go off, and then I'm like, yeah, forget it, whatever. Trying at different times. So. But I'll stick around for a few minutes, or if you guys want to grab a brochure, I've got some books for sale if anybody's interested. Like I said, stop by the museum. Open 7 days a week. And the festival is always in September. It's always that 3rd weekend in September. It's on a Saturday and a Sunday. And on Friday evenings, we do a Kickstarter. So a lot of people are coming to town on Friday evenings. The hotels are all sold out. If you live here, it's convenient. But if you're from Chicago or somewhere like that, the hotels are sold out for probably a 2 or 3 hour radius on a lot of those, Huntington, Charleston, places like that. Because, it's, again, the festival's turned into just a big place for a lot. It's like a family reunion. They all come every year. I mean, we got this one older couple that's been to every festival except for the first one. And they bring a little book, and they have everybody sign that book for them and stuff. And the sad thing was they came this year and they didn't know about Carol, about her passing away. It just kind of broke their heart. They came and we had to tell them about that and stuff. But yeah, like I said, if you come to Point Pleasant, you come to the Mothman Museum, you've got the statue, you've got the River Museum, Riverfront Park, all that. So the festival and the museum has been a good drawing card for Point Pleasant. And that's what we intended to do, with the festival when we started. We just didn't realize 12,000 people were going to start showing up. So. Okay?
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. The festival is always in September. It's always that 3rd weekend in September.